And welcome to the Continuity of Operations for Communications Center PSAP webinar. We're going to be discussing the continuity of operations or COOP planning for your PSAP. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our guests today. We have Jim Stromberg, an Emergency Communications Coordinator with CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's Integrated Operations Division. Jim, if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you.
Hey, thanks for attending this webinar on PSAP Continuity of Operations Plans. My name is Jim Stromberg, and I'm an Emergency Communications Coordinator for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. That's more easily pronounced CISA, C-I-S-A. The Wisconsin Office of Emergency Communication, in partnership with the Wisconsin Interoperability Committee, recognized the value of PSAP continuity of operations plans and included the development of a PSAP COOP template in their September 2022 strategic plan. They then came to CISA for our subject matter expertise in bringing this concept to a reality. For the past 9 months, CISA has been working with Jessica Jimenez from WEM's Office of Emergency Communications and volunteers from Wisconsin's PSAP community to develop a PSAP COOP template. This has been a wonderful example of local, state, and federal partnership to improve public safety in Wisconsin. Thank you to all the volunteers from Wisconsin's PSAP community. Thank you to Jessica Jimenez for her leadership, and thank you for being here today to learn about this important project.
Thank you, Jim. And also with us, Jessica Jimenez, the Next Gen 911 Program Manager from the Wisconsin Office of Emergency Communications. Jessica, if you have a few words for us today.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. Hello, everyone. As Glenn mentioned, my name is Jessica Jimenez. I am the Next Gen 911 Program Manager working under the Office of Emergency Communications within the Department of Military Affairs. And I just want to first thank you all for joining us today to present the new template continuity of operations plan for PSAPs and 911 services in Wisconsin. Some of you may have joined us for the introductory webinar back in November to kick off this project, where CISA went through the importance of continuity of operations planning for PSAPs and some of the key elements of those continuity plans. At that time, we did ask for volunteers to assist us in developing a Wisconsinized version of the template for PSAPs to use here in the state. And that group met back in February to provide feedback on a draft template. And we've spent the last few months incorporating that feedback into the version that was sent out to my distribution lists and is now available on the OEC website. Before I pass it off to Glenn to go through the content today, I just want to mention a few key things about this template. The template is not required. It was developed by subject matter experts and stakeholders to provide a resource for PSAPs looking to create a continuity plan or improve their existing plans. You may choose to use all of it or take out what you don't need and make it your own. The template includes a lot of outside resources and examples you can use to help build your own plan. So I encourage you to take a look at some of those resources within the template as you are going through each section of the plan. For those PSAPs seeking grants under the state chapter DMA2 PSAP grant program, the template includes the PSAP continuity of operations elements required for that grant eligibility. While the template is not required, there are sections in the template that cover the areas that are required for grant eligibility related to PSAP continuity planning. And I'll point those areas out throughout the presentation, but they are also notated in the template itself. And with that, I just want to thank you all again for joining us today. And Glenn, I will pass it back to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Jessica. Again, my name is Glenn Kleitch. I work in support of CISA's Emergency Communications Division through the ICTAP program. That's the Interoperable Communications Technical Assistance Program. My background a little bit, 21 years in the PSAP world, starting as a dispatcher, a trainer, a supervisor, acting director. And then I spent 4 years as the statewide interoperability coordinator for the state of Colorado. So I've had a little bit of work in the PSAP world, comfortable with what we're doing, and also I understand the need of why we're doing what we're doing, why Wisconsin has taken this as an important element in their effort to make the PSAPs within the state much more resilient and better able to recover from a tragic event of some sort. As Jessica mentioned, we started out this plan to develop a COOP template, help you maintain that grant eligibility, also work on networking, work with communication leaders from throughout Wisconsin, and strengthen your resiliency against key events, or tough events. So the goal of the project was to make you the facilitator, make you more able to gather that information from your stakeholders for a Wisconsin and agency-specific template, and then you can present use the template to build your plan with your stakeholders to serve your agency. We want you to be that facilitator and work with those key decision makers in making your plan the best that it can be. The workshop objectives we went through, making you that facilitator, making you able to build that workshop, build that template, and make it as strong as it can. Help you understand what are the key parts of a COOP, and we have a COOP template that we're going to have present to you today, giving you that structure, the framework to build your own plan. So we'll talk now about some of the basics of continuity planning, help you understand what are our objectives, what do we want to accomplish, do we want to, or what those definitions are, what those elements of a COOP are, and then we're going to talk about the main concepts within a COOP. Among those objectives, we want you to be able to continue to carry out those essential missions that you as a PSAP are responsible for. We want to minimize loss of life, minimize damage to property, keep those assets that we depend on safe and secure, keep our information safe and secure as well. We also will have to deal with succession planning in case someone's not able to perform specific duties during an event where we have to evacuate a center. Who's going to assume those key leadership positions? Bottom line, we want to mitigate and reduce those disruptions to your operations so you can continue to provide communication services to your community. And then once it's all over, we have to be able to get back to a normal sort of operations. In a COOP, or the COOP plan, it's got to be ready to go all the time. We have to be able to pull the trigger and activate that COOP plan. Once we're done with our COOP event, where we had to set up alternate operations, we have to sometime get back to restoration of normal operations. Not knowing how long that might be, the plan is structured to let you sustain operations for as long as necessary. And this will include regularly scheduled trainings on the COOP. How do you activate it? What happens when it's activated? And then exercise that, practice. Because if you don't practice it, you don't get better at it. When you work with your stakeholders to build a successful COOP plan, bring everyone to the table. Give outside personnel a chance to look at it, get that different point of view. Does this make sense as we're going through this? We have to keep our staff well aware of what's going on, keep them trained, keep those lines of succession clearly identified. Probably better to identify that to a role rather than a specific person. So a supervisor might step into the acting director position. We do have to do those exercises at least annually, test the plan, make sure our personnel know what's going on with it. How do we do it? We have to maintain that plan. Every time you update a new policy, we have to make sure the plan reflects that. What does the alternate work site look like? Do we have what we need at that location? And do we have a plan to improve our COOP plan as we go along? Let's talk a little bit about some of the key terms we're going to discuss today. First one is devolution, and that is going from normal operations to some sort of an alternate operations, transferring those functions and the authority to from the primary staff conducting that to other agency employees perhaps, and different facilities, making sure those mission essential functions can continue. Reconstitution is us getting from that alternate work site and alternate workflow back to a sense of normalcy. The authorities, that's our official position or permission rather, to act on behalf of another. It's defined in law, state statute, regulations, municipal code, whatever that might be for your jurisdiction. And we have references, that's our legal citations. Where did that authority come from? And those citations ensure that we can revise that plan as required and give us those best practices. Mission essential functions. What are those key duties that you within your PSAP must do, not only statutorily, but to keep business flowing, to keep your personnel out in the field safe, to keep them informed, to give the citizens a chance to report incidents to the comm center and get that information out to the first responders. The delegation of authority, that's just assigning that responsibility from one personnel to another, somebody assuming those duties if someone else is unable to do so. Who does that? That's our order of succession. The defined order of who does what and when on behalf of senior leadership in case they are unavailable or incapacitated. Then we have those vital records. What do we need to keep a hold of to conduct those mission essential functions? That could be our software or services that we need to support those mission essential functions. We may need access, secure access to things like NCIC records, the warrants, the restraining orders, driver's licenses and registrations, etc. All right. I'm going to walk through some of the key elements of a COOP template before we get into the actual one we built for Wisconsin. We'll talk about those sections within the COOP. We're going to talk about the key questions that each section should answer. And before we begin any planning, we want to have a forward within that plan, talking about the importance of it. Sometimes that's a letter from a senior leader discussing the importance of the plan and recognizing the contributions of those who crafted it. The word supersedes. Over time, we will get many different versions of a plan. As a new plan is issued, it will supersede or replace the existing plan. Mentioned earlier, the authorities and references. We do have to follow state, federal, and local laws and regulations. That information, your COOP plan, gets shared with those other agencies that you support. Applicability and scope, that's going to be a section identifying which departments or agencies are meant to use the plan. Perhaps that's all the PSAPs within your county, or if there's only one within your county, it could be a regional approach to it. The scope, we're looking at all hazards. It covers a broad range of circumstances when that COOP might be implemented. The linkages and dependencies, the COOP plan belongs to an ecosystem of documents. So it's important to list the policies, procedures that depend on the document. Other documents that are used in conjunction with the COOP should be identified within your plan so we can reference those and have copies of them, such as an emergency operations plan, an IT disaster recovery plan, etc. Could even include building evacuations. We're going to make design some scenarios and some assumptions. The THIRA is the threat and hazard identification and risk assessment. Not all agencies use that. Some use other forms of gathering data on those threats and hazards and what are the key risks within your county. We need to know what those are that could cause us to have to evacuate our communication center. Could be a refinery or something within your community. It could be a dam. It could be a major highway or a rail yard where tankers of methyl ethyl bad stuff starts leaking and causes a crisis within your community. The scenarios are based on the top 5 THIRA threats that are identified or other ways of identifying those threats. and how are we going to develop our plan to work around and respond to those threats. And the assumptions, we're going to make assumptions that bound the plan. It helps us collect and validate that information periodically. And again, the plan's going to change. It's a dynamic document and needs to be regularly updated. Let's go into some concepts of operations here. We have leadership, command and control, personnel, alternate work sites, communication plans, and those mission essential functions, plus the activities that support those mission essential functions. We call those ESAs, or essential supporting activities. Delegations of authority fall under the leadership, command and control section. As we discussed, there's two types of delegation of authorities. Responsibilities assigned by regulation or state statute. Those require formal delegations and who's receiving that authority when it's passed. And the second type is the responsibility assigned to a person's role or a position within that organization. Orders of succession include the positions which are designated to fulfill a critical role should the incumbent become unable to fulfill their duties. The successors should be named as a role, not an individual. So think broadly about those positions. You could have finance and procurement staff, IT. They're all equally important to the mission and to the activation. Make sure we include those in our discussions. Critical information requirements. These are things that help an incident commander make key decisions. They need, if there's an injury to some of our field personnel, they need to know that. If there's a major disruption affecting citizens, those are things that the commander would need to know. Helps with personnel accountability, the status of critical systems. We lose a major IT system, whether that's radio, phone, any of the other software platforms that support our business. And then we have the situation updates if there's something critical that your command staff need to know. And then the devolution statement is going to talk about the criteria, which will help our decision makers decide we're no longer able to do business as normal and we have to devolve. We have to move to that alternate communications site, whether fully or partially, to support the operation, depending on what's happened within your center. In the COOP plan, there's a list on personnel. We're going to talk about key personnel that lead the operation while it's ongoing. Similar to the orders of succession, we need to name the role and not the person. Key people might be a director of continuity, a reconstitution coordinator. We need someone to coordinate the alternate work site, somebody to manage our essential records, and then a critical systems manager. Then we'll have a COOP team, and that's going to be the executive team, an advanced team to set things up as we make the transition from normal work to an alternate work site, an emergency relocation team, an operations team, support team. You may not have all of those within your jurisdiction. You may have a limited number, or you may have to wear many hats to get that accomplished. Roles and responsibilities, and part of that, the reason for that section is to document those responsibilities and the tasks that are assigned to each role across all 4 phases of the COOP life cycle. Now, the best way to accomplish that is to use a table with one column with the individual and the team listed, and then a column for preparation, activation, and response, continuity operations, and then when it's all over, that reconstitution. Staff augmentation. Sometimes we don't have enough people to handle the job, whether it's a staffing issue that's been ongoing, or we have some of our personnel that are unable to come to work because of access or injury or something like that. So we may need to bring in some extra help when a COOP is activated. We'll have to find those ways to augment the staff by using perhaps other personnel within your jurisdiction. Have some people come in to help answer non-emergency phone lines, things like that. Mutual aid and an official or a formal agreement with you and a neighboring agency perhaps to provide extra support for you. We also have to be aware of how to get our people to a new location. That's our transportation side. Food and lodging. We've got to feed them while they're there. If they're unable to leave to access food, where do they rest and recover during downtime when they're not on duty? So that lodging is important. We have to make sure that alternate sites allow for sleeping quarters and hygiene plans. We need those porta potties, perhaps. We need something to help support our team. Also helps with team morale to have a plan for housing those displaced personnel. Within the COOP, we're going to talk about an alternate work site. We want details about where it is, what's the address, how do we get there, who's the point of contact there. It's helpful to document that GPS location. You can use either the traditional lat long if an addressing structure is not available. There's an app called What 3 Words, and that'll provide a location, very precise location. If you haven't heard of What 3 Words, it's worth checking out. It's a great application for citizens to find their location or your staff to find them. So for each location, declare the type of site. Is it going to be a hot? Is it going to be a warm? Is it going to be cold? Isn't everything shut down, or things are partially functioning, or things are fully ready to plug and play? Just sit down and go to work. How is that site laid out? Space configuration. Where is the primary dispatch console? Where's the call taking place? What technologies do we need within that? Our communications, our technology. Itemize what we have, what's available, what's not available as we work in that alternate capacity. Must keep the site secure. We have citizens that like to respond to public safety agency locations. An alternate work site for your comm center may not be the best place to have citizens showing up. So we need to have that site secure, whether it's locked doors or personnel securing those access points to your alternate site. And then some site logistic capabilities. What are those details? What do we have at that site to help us receive information, shipments of equipment, shipments of food and water, things like that. We do have to be able to communicate. Management has to be able to communicate with each other, with the senior leaders communicating to subordinate staff. It may include how the leadership team will remain in contact with each other, those other senior officials, elected officials, the city or county administrators, the emergency management personnel. It's important to follow a PACE plan. We'll talk about that in a little bit down the road here. The plan should identify those primary, alternate, contingent, and emergency methods of communications. If special devices are required, if we need something like satellite phones, where do we get them? Are they active and updated, ready to work? Employee communications will include in the plan how information is passed from the management team to the rest of the employees. The plan should identify whether the mechanism supports confirmation of receipt of message. How secure is that message? How reliable is it? And when messages are passed, the plan should identify whether you're using multiple paths, single paths, or if there's multiple, is it simultaneous or sequential? Vendor communications, yeah, our equipment breaks, malfunctions, whether it's hardware or software. It might be necessary to engage your service providers for help migrating to that alternate work site. Basically, vendors need to be kept on that need-to-know basis. We want to have details about what we can share, what we can't share, requirements of, and those non-disclosure agreements with you and the vendor. This is going to be impacted by communications and other limitations on what's happened. And then there's the media communications. Primary purpose of this section will provide guidance to a public information officer regarding policies and procedures for the public release of information. The plan should identify which media outlets to engage, when we should engage them. And the second part of that should be guidelines for the staff on how to respond to those inquiries from the media. I know we don't necessarily like to talk to the media, but they can also be used as a tool to help us share information, critical information with the citizens, which could in effect reduce the call volume by having them educated through their normal distribution of information, whether that's broadcast, print, or social media. Mission essential functions. These are these activities that just have to occur, either by law or in order for the PSAP to remain functional. There's several common functions associated with PSAPs. As you know, we've got to get those 911 and non-emergent calls answered. We have to get that information dispatched to law enforcement, fire, EMS. We've got to maintain critical operation, those technical systems, whether that's radio, phone, CAD, records management, our link to NCIC, and keep our facility secure. The essential supporting activities, those include the capabilities that are the activities that we have to do to keep those mission essential functions flowing. What are just those key elements that we have to do to keep those functions happening? And at some point, those mission essential functions are going to be transitioned to a recovery time objectives. How long are we going to work in accomplishing the mission essential functions as an alternate work site? So all dependencies of the missional ascension functions, we have to get that recovery time objective. That's going to help us prioritize the actions that we need to take once the COOP plan is activated. Within a COOP plan, we're going to have that operational phase and implementation. And COOP is really only as strong as the measures that are taken in advance of an incident. We have to activate, and we have to relocate, and that's our second section there. We have to keep that operation continuing. We have to plan for and then go back to normal. We've got to maintain the plan, and then we'll have appendices attached to the back of the plan. So to prepare, we have to pre-position those resources in that alternate work site. We need to have our staff ready to go, and when they go, have those go kits or a drive-away kit. Have printed copies of the COOP within their go kit, as well as other key documents that they might need to have. Some SOPs, contact lists. Those are always hard to maintain accurate and updated lists. We become technology dependent. And if we don't have access to a CAD system to recover that on-call list of resources that we need, such as a tow company or our vendor support for fixing broken systems, we might need maps and other supplies for the advanced team to take, fresh batteries for radios if we're working off of portables, food, water, and change of clothes, things like that that might be in a drive-away or a go kit. We need to help our staff and their families prepare for a chance or a need to be away from home, to handle things while they're away. And it's not just the physical things, it's the mental things as well. We'll talk about that in a bit. Preventive maintenance, got to make sure those batteries are charged, make sure those lists are updated, make sure that we have the equipment we need where we need it, and make sure it's serviceable. Make sure those computer updates on the laptop are current. So when somebody opens up the laptop to start a CAD session, they don't have a bunch of Windows updates that need to be carried through. On the activation and relocation section, the decision makers, we're going to identify who the personnel are who are authorized to make the determination. Are we going to activate the COOP depending on the level of that emergency that exists? Are we going to do a full activation? Are we going to do a partial activation of that? So we need guidance for the key personnel on the hot seat there to give them guidance on how to make that decision. So a 2x2 matrix with rows indicating whether there's advance warning of the situation or whether it's reactionary time where we have to respond to what's already happened. So we can have a chance to identify what that is. The plan should follow the process for collecting information. We need that direction. We're going to take care of health and safety of our personnel. What are the impacts going to be on those mission essential functions? Do we have weather or other situational intelligence reports we have to deal with? What's the status of our communications and information systems? How long is this going to last? Is this a one-day thing? Is this going to be a week-long thing? Or is the normal work site completely inaccessible and it's going to be a long term before we have something up and replaced? And what's the operational status of our mutual aid partners? Who's going to come and help us? The alerts and notifications section will indicate what the plan is for sharing information. So for each level of emergency that's identified, we need to know who we're going to notify, how we're going to notify them, and who's responsible for those notifications. And then the relocation process. When we have to go, where are we going to go? What are we going to do? So we need to have an advanced team head to the alternate work site, test the equipment, make sure it's up and running. Staff will likely want to use their personal vehicle to travel to the alternate work site. That may not always be possible. We may have to engage some sort of a private carrier or other personnel to transport our staff to that alternate work site. So we need to think about that in advance. Where are we going to go? Then we're going to have to work with our vendors as necessary to reroute our phones to the alternate work site, get those 911 calls from the landline provider and our cell providers to ring at the proper location. Once we get to that location, we have to have people checked in, make sure we have personnel accountability, seating assignments, recover or retrieve your pre-positioned equipment, make sure we're keeping track of our people that are still on the way, and then deploy those critical technologies to reestablish those mission essential functions, and then keep our staff updated, not just our line staff, but our leadership staff as well. Then we get to the continuity of operations. This is business as abnormal. As we've moved to that new location, we're going to have those mission critical systems that we have to keep up and running. We're going to have those vital records and databases that have to be maintained. And then we have to maintain that communications and technology. All important stuff to keep us responding to those mission essential functions. Have to keep that site secure. We have to not let the wrong people into our building. This could protect the health, safety, and emotional well-being of our staff. We need to make sure that they're comfortable and they're protected where they are. Financial management's another one. We have to keep our people paid, keep them coming to work. I know we do it because we love the job, but we do it also to be paid. We have to track other expenses as we're in an alternate work site. So we have to keep track of what did we pay for that pallet of bottled water? What did we pay for the food that was brought in? And then keep that accountability. It's going to help at the end when we go to collect reimbursement if there's grant funding or federal or state relief coming to support this type of an event. There's also some meetings that need to continue to help an organization function. So there are regular meetings that may be required or needed, such as city council, things like that. So if the impact of the event is short, we might simply just reschedule that meeting to another day. But if the impact is long, we may need to get those meetings rescheduled to another location, another time, and then figure out how and when we're going to conduct those meetings. Hopefully, we get to this point, and that's that reconstitution process. So our decision makers are going to evaluate what's happened, where we are right now, and what needs to be done to get us back to our normal work site and get work to return back to normal. So there's going to be a process to make that happen. The section of the COOP will resemble the section in the activation, but in reverse. So we're confirming that the original facility is capable of being reoccupied. We need to document this stuff. The remainder of the section should detail the process for migrating from the alternate work sites back to the primary work site. Make sure everything's operational, make sure our staff knows what that timeline is. Then once it's all said and done, really important to conduct that after action review. Do it after an exercise, do it after an activation. Who's responsible for facilitating that after action report? And then make sure that we review items that come up and implement necessary changes. We need an intro in the AAR, with an executive summary telling what happened that caused us to need to activate the COOP. What parts of the plan were activated, what were the circumstances, and then details of the process. It's important that all members of the organization are invited to participate. Granted, it's hard to get our personnel off of a console or the phone lines to answer or to attend these meetings, but seek their input, even if it's a written evaluation of what's happened. We want to know, how well did the plan work? Did anyone find that they just didn't know what to do next? Did you see anyone who didn't have an assignment or task? How do we get them to take that on? What actions are we going to take to improve the process? And did our devolution plan work? Going back to normal, did everything go sequentially like we hoped it would? Those are the kind of questions to ask. And then once you get done with the AAR, out of that, find those elements that didn't work perfectly, but could be improved, or something that just didn't work at all. Develop a new method to accomplish it. And then we're going to, down the road, practice, drill, and rehearse, exercise those plans again. In the COOP, we're going to identify plan management. We want to talk about who's responsible for it. We want to test and train, exercise regularly, and approach this as a multi-year strategy. It's not a one-size-fits-all, do it once and put it on the shelf and it's over with. There are needs to update this. There are needs to integrate this with other plans, an emergency operations plan, whatever other plans that your organization might have. How were our alerts and warnings tied in with our COOP? Was it effective? Were we able to meet those mission essential functions and update and modify the plan as necessary? Did all of the elements that we went through function as we wanted them to? All right, some resources we'll leave you with on the structure here. FEMA has an IS 1300 Introductory to Continuity of Operations course. I encourage you to take that. NINA and APCO also have some documents that will help you understand and structure your COOP plan. Okay, now I'm going to go into Wisconsin's specific plan, and this is going to talk about some of the key elements that are Wisconsin specific. We're not going to go page by page through the document. It's too long for the time we have allowed right now, but we will get a chance to look at some of those elements and get some questions answered. We started the program on developing this template in Georgia, moved it to Massachusetts, and then took it to Wisconsin. Wisconsin's grabbed it and run with it. We've had a lot of input from the PSAP personnel that have played a key role in developing this process. The way we're structured on the template here is should be anything in green font or green text is instructions for you as the COOP facilitator working with your agency, your key personnel in developing this plan. The green text is ideas to help you have those conversations, develop your plan. So here we note that we're going to have a letter from the PSAP director talking about why we're building a COOP plan. Have some signature blocks, who's responsible, identify those contact information. The orange text is sample or optional language that you can incorporate within your COOP plan. So we have the green part for instructions, helps generate those conversations when you, as the facilitator, build the plan for your agency. You can use the suggested language if you want, not required to, and you're not required to use every section of the COOP. You're not required to use it at all, but it is important when we're talking about plans and grant funding. A section to keep track of those changes. We'll have that sample language in there, some discussion of what needs to be documented, what needs to be taken care of, what those changes are that we have to have or that have happened to the plan, so we can make sure that we're all operating from the most current version. Earlier today, we talked about those authorities and references, some description of what they are, generate those conversations. And then I've listed here, and we've listed in the template, some reference material for you, some of those authorities that give you that authority and responsibility to carry out those the COOP plan. Included in the guide on either the left or the right margin is some notes to help you be more effective as that facilitator. It tells you what you're doing, gives you some of those key questions, and then some best practices. So dividing the mission essential functions and those essential supporting activities into maximum allowable disruptions. That's going to help you restrict your activities to what's most effective and most necessary to keep you going. Again, the orange text is sample font or sample ideas for you to create your plan. Feel free to alter it as you see fit for your agency. It's just suggestions. As we move on, we will identify some of those key personnel. Who's going to do what? And we talked about identifying people as, or job descriptions as, who's going to do it by role rather than by individual personnel. You can choose to keep it as individual personnel. It's just harder to update when there are staff changes. So that's going to focus on the people part of the plan. We're going to define those teams. What are the policies that are associated with the care and feeding of our staff? How do we get them where they need to be? How do we take care of them while they're there? How do we function in that alternate location? So what are those roles? What are those elements that have to be done to achieve the mission essential functions described in our concept of operations? What are some best practices that we need to take to keep that order of succession going, to respond to whatever the incident might be? Sorry about that. As we move on, go ahead, Jessica.
On that one, yeah, thank you. So the 731, you'll notice here, this is the first reference in the slide deck so far, but the note here about details in this section are required for applicant eligibility under the Chapter DMA2 PSAP grant program. So those notes will be in each section that covers areas that are required for that grant eligibility. So in this particular section, it's covering, the roles and responsibilities of a communications response team that may be deployed to restore emergency services operations. And so in this area, we're really looking for what are those roles and responsibilities. And I'll mention those throughout the rest of this, but if you are looking for a list of what the Chapter DMA2 PSAP grant program requirements are, please do reach out and I can give you that information as well. Back to Glenn. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate that. All right, let's move on then to some of those roles and responsibility definitions. This section should detail those required roles, those responsibilities for our people, including details on what, if any, can be handled or filled by an outside resource. It's important to note that this is focused on the role and the task and not necessarily on personnel assignments. So what we could be looking at is what are legal minimum staffing requirements? What's the operational feasibility or the operationally feasible minimum? So you can have a legal minimum, but you might have an operationally minimum staff. What's feasible to do your job? How do those roles and responsibilities change by position from day-to-day operations during the plan implementation? It's going to evolve. It's constantly changing. What mutual aid resources do we have or do we need to accomplish our job? How do we support those resources? What do our personnel need? Food, housing, in order to operate under the plan. And we need to ensure that any personnel augmentation is approved by our human resources department and our legal department, and make sure that any required mutual aid agreements are complete and signed by the agencies. These are tasks that you want to accomplish on the blue sky days, not when we're in the middle of a storm. So the chart here talks about what those tasks are, or gives you a chance to identify the tasks based on how your activation of the plan has gone. If you have the planning phase, that's when you get those agreements in place. The activation and relocation, we're getting it, moving to that new location. While we're in that operation, that's the orange part, and then the green part is when we're heading back to normal operations. Staff augmentation and mutual aid. We propose here a breakdown of how severe our operation has been compromised. We might have a small portion of our staff, up to a quarter of the staff, unable to work. Does that involve mandatory overtime? Do we bring in part-time staff or reserve staff? Do we start looking at those memorandums of understanding, memorandums of agreement with our neighboring jurisdictions? If our operations have degraded enough that half of our staff, up to half, can't get to work, we might be kicking in those MOUs and MOAs. We might be reaching out to the state for some additional help with this. We might have a more impaired operation where we have up to 75% of our staff unable to work. What's our key source for help? It may or may not be the state. It might be looking secondarily to a TERT team, the telecommunicator emergency response team, coming in to help. And if we have up to half of our, or up to all of our staff unable to work, we might be fully dependent upon bringing in that outside help. Mental health and employee support. Do we have the ability to take care of our staff? Not only are they dealing with other people's crises, they may be dealing with their own. They have family or friends in a troubled zone where something may have happened. Are we taking care of our staff? Are we getting them the support they need in real time? Do we have some flexibility on staffing to allow for daycare? Are we moving to a 24-hour operation with on-shift rest time? Or do we have transportation? Or do we have a place to bring people in for childcare close by? Whatever that might be within your jurisdiction. What do we have available to assist our personnel? Because if they are completely distracted with their own personal crisis, they're going to be unable to be effective in their job. So they also have that impact associated with why we had to activate the COOP. Alternate work site requirements. We're going to identify what the site is, whether it's permanent or temporary, how many people we can get in there. What's the status of that work site? Are things up and running, ready to go? Do we have limitations in there? We note here in the chart bandwidth. Do we have to have a VPN? What are the restrictions on that? And I know Jessica's got some details here that she would like to go over on what those grant requirements are in your alternate work site.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. So really just identification of an alternate operation site is one of the requirements for the continuity plans for grant eligibility. I do also just want to point out, you'll see in the template and in the facilitator guide, the appendices does include sample MOUs that can be used for backup PSAP operations as well. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jessica. The alerts and notifications. This is how we share that information. We have to share it. We talked about before, multiple ways to do it. So we've identified as a sample here, the emergency relocation group, the advanced team. Who sends out the message? How are we sending out the message? What the message is. Make sure your staff understands what a COOP is. It's not where the chickens live, but this is our continuity of operations plan. So the instructions are what to do. Just like when we send messages to the community, make sure it's clear, concise, and actionable, to where there's no ambiguity in it. So having those messages pre-planned, pre-written will certainly help that on-duty supervisor or whoever's assuming that role get that information out. And they have enough on their mind as it is. Let's make it as easy as possible and accomplish these pre-planned message development in advance, again, when the skies are blue. And then do we want to have a response? Do we have to have that message confirmed as received? Mentioned earlier the PACE planning, and this is identifying those ways that we're going to communicate. So on voice communications, our primary might be, we'll say it's the 800 megahertz radio system. If the alternate might be a previously used VHF radio system and handing out pack sets to personnel in the field so we can still communicate. What's that contingent plan? Is it cell phones? Is it smoke signals? What is it going to be that helps us make that that contingent plan? Or is it emergency communications down to that bottom level of what's our last line of defense? Could be bringing in amateur ham radio personnel to build up a ham network to help our communications. Those are the type of things we can do, and we'll identify that for each of our communication pathways for voice, networking, conferencing, and then storing data and the file exchange. And I know there's some grant program requirements on this. Jessica will evaluate or expand on that.
Yeah, really in this section, we're looking for interoperable communications planning and operations. I know PACE plans are something that the federal government has been pushing or will be pushing moving forward. And so really it's just a good practice to kind of look at what your alternate communications are and making sure that they are interoperable with anyone that you would need to communicate with.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. Let's talk about the drive away kits or the go kit, whatever you want to call it within your agency. But we have a chance to identify what the equipment is necessary and required for your agency within the go kit. So when somebody has it in the trunk of their car, they can grab it and go. When is it evaluated for completeness and currency on up-to-date information? Those on-call lists, those vendor points of contact. Do we have all that information we might need? Who's responsible for maintaining readiness on that kit? How often do we want to maintain that? The testing, training, and exercise. How often do we need to do that? There's our requirements, grant requirements that will require it. We were proposing here testing the alert notification and activation procedures at least quarterly. Test your comm equipment at least quarterly and make sure vital record accuracy, currency is at all the locations, not just the alternate work site or multiple alternate work sites, but what's in the go kit. I cut off the list because it doesn't fit on a slide well, but we've proposed even more beyond that. And there are some grant requirements associated with this as well.
Yeah, it's related to this section, just very basically, the grant eligibility requirements do require employee training exercises necessary to implement and maintain the plan. So making sure that you're identifying what those training exercises look like for your agency. And then at a minimum, the telecommunicators at your PSAP must be trained at least annually in the plan.
All right, thanks, Jessica. And then at the end, there will be a section of appendices. And this is going to help us, well, basically make our book a lot bigger of what are we going to do? What are those associated plans? How do we handle it, like the electronic storage of documents? How do we have copies of those mutual aid contracts and agreements or contracts with vendors? We may have to have that supply of bottled water, having a prearranged contract where we can pick up and call the Pepsi or the Coca-Cola bottling company and say, hey, we need a pallet of water at this location, and the price is already agreed for, already ready to be paid for them. Major projects are signed work orders, procedures, checklists, identifying what those mission essential functions are in a list, have it in your appendices. Have your essential supporting activities identified. Have a floor plan for the alternate work site and have a copy of it posted at the doorway to that alternate work site. So when somebody comes to the door, whether it's some of our field personnel, law enforcement, fire, EMS, they know where to go to talk to their dispatcher or to talk to the call takers. Also, it's your rosters, emergency contact information, key leadership contact. How do you get a hold of the city manager or the mayor or the chair of the county commission or any of the media outlets, whoever else we need to get a hold of? We have to be able to get a hold of the leaders of each of our stakeholders, whether that's the fire chief for each of the agencies that we serve, the police chief, the sheriff, the EMS leader, the emergency manager. Don't forget the EM side of the house, because they're going to be integrally involved in the process here. Well, that's going to wrap up my portion of the presentation today. Jessica, do you have anything else you want to add today?
Yeah, just a couple of last minute things. In the appendices, there is also a couple of grant requirements. In particular, the contact information section, making sure you have a list of essential contacts, including PSAP and emergency services staff, as well as there is an appendix on the ICS, Incident Command System 205, which is related to interoperable communications, planning, and operations. So I do just encourage you, I believe we have a link in there to our Wisconsin Field Operation Guide, or the WIFOG, which does assist in filling out that ICS 205 form for interoperable communications. In addition, we had added in the appendix a checklist for IPAWs related to PSAPs that are alert originators for alerts and warnings, making sure that you're accommodating or planning for if you are an alert originator and your center is down, who's taking over that responsibility. So if you have any questions on that, please do reach out to Paul Hughes at Wisconsin Emergency Management, and he'd be more than happy to walk you through that process. And then lastly here, just want to thank you all for joining us. We hope you found that this webinar was informative. Just as a reminder, the template is not required, but can be used to design your own plan or improve on your existing plans. The template is also designed to cover that the PSAP continuity of operations elements required for the state PSAP grant program eligibility. I tried to point those out, but the sections are the sections covering areas required for grant eligibility are notated throughout the template. I did just want to also mention that not all sections in this template are required for the grants. If your PSAP also applied and received a state grant in fiscal year 23, you do not need to rebuild your continuity of operations plan. The grant eligibility requirements have not changed for fiscal year 24. This is just to assist anyone who wants to update their plans or maybe didn't have a plan in fiscal year 23 to meet the grant eligibility requirements and now want to establish a plan for that purpose. If you have any further questions about the template, please do feel free to reach out to myself, Jessica. Hopefully everyone has my email. Otherwise, it is on our website, oec.widma.gov. I just want to thank you all again for joining and hope you have a good rest of the day.